We are studying Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad, which has placed before us four facets of the human experience through which it tries to lead us to the recognition of the divine. First, the creative word, which is behind our speech. The second, the mind, which is behind our mind. Third, the senses of sight, hearing, which are behind our senses. And finally, the breath of life, which is behind our life. Through these four gateways, in sequence, it is leading us to the recognition of the Brahman, who is life of our life, sense of our sense, mind of our mind, and the creative word of our speech. In the process, through these four, we are also led to ascend from our existing experience of creativity, of thought, of sense perception, and of the life experience to something which is a divine creative power, a divine mind, a divine sense perception, and culminating in a divine life. So the text itself aims at leading us through an introspective process to an ascent of consciousness into a divine supramental life. These four are steps and stages also, and Sri Aurobindo is commenting on each of these successively. After discussing the creative word, we are now looking at his elaboration of the mind behind our mind, that which he has named the supermind, which the Veda calls the Vijnana. In the chapter we are currently studying, Sri Aurobindo takes us through a rational justification for such a supermind to exist. And in the process, he shows us how the evolutionary process itself follows certain steps and principles. And if we pursue that logically, we end up with a supermind which is beyond our mind, which is already embedded instinctively as essential instinctive processes in our mind, and through it is developing its own forms of emergence. With, in the last portion that we read, the same logic of the evolutionary process is used to describe even the nature of the transition that is to take place in the present ascension of humanity. And this chapter now culminates with the last two paragraphs that we will now take up, where this whole rational and evolutionary description of the supermind is completed. And the next chapter then dwells on what exactly that supermind is in terms of consciousness and experience, and how are we to ascend to it and realize it. So in the last two paragraphs that we now take up, Sri Aurobindo is changing the focus from the evolutionary process which he used to justify the supermind to what the Kena itself discusses. And the Kena Upanishad does not speak of the supermind or mind of our mind from a rational or evolutionary perspective. It sees that by a direct spiritual experience and by an intuitive knowledge. But Sri Aurobindo must satisfy the demands of the modern mind, which is rational, and therefore, rather than simply accepting that as a given, as something of a matter of faith that we have to accept because of our own intuition or because of the intuition of others, but he uses the mind's capacity to justify this consciousness, and at the same time creates deep resonances in our own intuition that we can begin to feel the conviction of this consciousness. And now in this paragraph which we take up, the two merge, the rational and the intuitive. He says, these considerations justify to the reason the idea of a mind beyond our mind, but only as a final evolution out of matter. So this has been the theme of the discussion so far. Rationally, we have seen this has to emerge. But we see this only as an emerging principle. The Upanishad, however, enthrones it as the already existing creator and ruler of mind. It is a secret principle already conscient and not merely contained inconsciently in the very stuff of things. But this is the natural conclusion, even apart from spiritual experience, from the nature of the supramental principle. For it is at its highest an eternal knowledge, will, bliss, and conscious being. And it is more reasonable to conclude that it is eternally conscious, though we are not conscious of it. And the source of the universe, than that it is eternally inconscient and only becomes conscient in time, as a result of the universe. So, this is the point where the intuition and the rationality unite. First, he says the Upanishad presents this mind of our mind as an already existing creator and ruler of the mind. That is, our mind is a product of that, and that is secretly ruling even our mind's processes. We've seen many examples of this before. Whenever we apply ourselves to any creative action, whenever we exercise the power of logic by any kind of induction, deduction, there is inherently something involved which is behind logic, beyond logic, without which the logical process could not be. And that thing behind is the secret supportive action of supermind, which justifies and acts through logic, which originates our own rational creative processes. And it is a simple matter of experience that we are most creative when least intending to be creative. When we try to be creative, our mind makes an effort to become creative, our creativity is the least effective. When we stop trying, it comes. And what comes is far greater than we could have conceived in any creative process. And where does it come from? From something beyond mind. And it can act through mind when mind becomes quiet. And the same with logic. When we lose ourselves in logical analysis, we can get so confused by the innumerable possibilities that we miss the whole point of the exercise. They say, there's a saying that you miss the woods for the trees. You get so caught up in counting the trees that you forget that there is a bigger picture. And it's only when you stop that excessive analysis and become quiet or throw aside in confusion and let your mind drift to other things that suddenly the insight pops up and you say, now I've got it. And where did it come from? It came from behind the mind. So the Upanishad presents this mind of our mind as the ruler of our existing power of thought, and it is also creator. Without that being there, our mind would not form, and our mind is only that super mind reducing itself, concealing itself, fragmenting itself, and operating in piecemeal fashion, sequential fashion, procedural fashion, rather than direct, integral, and unitive. So it is a secret principle already conscient and not merely contained inconsciently in the very stuff of things. So far, because we saw its emergence from an evolutionary perspective, we always saw life embedded inside matter slowly emerging, mind embedded inside life slowly emerging, and then supermind emerging out of mind slowly. So it seems as if supermind is somewhere down there in some inconscient condition, and it is gradually emerging, and with the emergence of the universe and humanity and evolution, it comes into its own. But this is not what the Upanishad says. The Upanishad says it is a secret principle already conscient up there. Now, this is not new as an idea in already what we have discussed. Sri Aurobindo pointed out how for mind to emerge or for life to emerge out of matter, an existing principle of life already operating freely in its own plane assists naturally this life embedded in matter which is struggling to come out. The same with the mind, that there is already a mental plane, assists immensely the mind emerging out of material life. And in the same way, the fact that there is already a supermind, active, conscious, we will even say superconscious, assists the emergence of the supermind which is now forming itself out of the human mind. So the Upanishad is pointing to that reality and not so much the embedded secret action of the supermind inside matter struggling to emerge. Now, these two perspectives are both complementary. We can see supermind up there free, as it always has been, without which the universe would not be born. Or we see that same supermind having embedded itself into the inconscience of matter, and then from below organizing the emergence of various gradations of matter, gradations of life, gradations of mind, and out of them organizing emergence of supermind. The two are different in terms of experience, but they are connected. The embedded supermind emerges from the free supermind, enters matter, and supports and develops evolution. If it was not embedded, then there would not be an evolution emerging. On the other hand, the emergence from below cannot be completed and come into full freedom unless there is the support from above. And it is this which Sri Aurobindo refers to in the little booklet, The Mother, when he says that the great and difficult task that we have set for ourselves, and he is referring there to the whole divinization of matter itself, of the human body and life, that can only be attained by two actions: the supermind descending from above and awakening the supermind from below. And so if there was not this principle already embedded in matter, there would be nothing to support the action of the supermind from above to transform matter. Matter could not have been divinized if this principle was already not present in matter. And yet that principle cannot emerge rapidly enough and come into its own freely unless there is the help of the action from above. So the dual action is key to the process of transformation of life. And Sri Aurobindo in this text does not explicitly discuss that, but in the very approach he has taken to show the action of the supermind below and above is pointing to this need for the unification or the connection of the two. When we discuss supermind working from below, we've seen examples of how it acts in mind, but we have also seen examples of how its influence is present even in life processes and in material development and material processes of crystalline structure. And having seen those examples, we do not conceive of supermind as something abstract. We do not see it as something which is unattainable. It is inherently the single most important driver of evolution. Without it, there would be no evolution, and every step of evolution is possible because it is pushing from below. And in the same way, when we turn upwards to the supermind above, free, we should not conceive of it as something abstract, distant, unattainable, but rather as something which is already working from above, acting on our mind, influencing our mind's processes, developing within our mind the necessary arrangements and instrumentalities by which it can manifest more and more directly. There was I think I mentioned this here or in the other class, there was a question by somebody recently: have you experienced supermind? And so rather than getting into didactical issues, I said simply, the supermind as the creative power behind the formation of the universe is the power which is in action in all the processes of the universe through veils. And in our own mind, when we exercise intellect, it is acting through two veils. And when we awaken to intuition, it is acting through a single veil. Each time you have an intuition, you have an experience of supermind which has reduced itself to a finite point. Innately, it is infinite, indivisible. But when it narrows itself and projects a single ray, a finite point, and enters the mind and awakens in us some insight, some knowledge, it is supermind which is working. And we must know it in these terms. Recognize the difference between its direct action and its veiled action, but still it is supermind. And therefore, all of us in our life have experienced its action in us, even if it is through one veil, two veils, or more. And so we should not conceive of it as something abstract, but something very concrete, very real, very active in us and through us. So it is a secret principle already conscient up there in its own consciousness. And then Sri Aurobindo says, but this is the natural conclusion, even apart from spiritual experience, from the nature of the supramental principle. We would conclude that it is there already because, as we have already seen, it is at its highest an eternal knowledge, will, bliss, and conscient being. And if that is its highest character, then it is already conscious, even if we are not conscious of it. It is already the source of the universe, even though we are still to express it in the unfolding evolution. So it does not need the universe to grow for it to exist. It is there, and that's why the universe grows. And so he concludes, our inconscience of it is no proof that it is inconscient of us. So we come now to the biggest obstacle. After all has the arguments against the supermind's existence have been dealt with convincingly, this last step remains when we can say, but how is it I don't feel it? Therefore, it must not exist. But he says, just because we are not conscious of it doesn't mean it is not conscious of us. There are experiences that all of us would have had at some point or other, states of deep concentration, deep meditation, in which you find yourself utterly conscious, differently conscious. And in that consciousness, you are aware that there is a universe out there, that you have a body, and that you have all these life experiences. But in that state, you have something which you do not have during your normal waking life experience state. You have something which you feel and know concretely and experience. But when you come out of that deep concentration and return to your so-called normal surface consciousness, that fades. The memory of that fades rapidly even, and all you have is a memory that you had experienced something. The thing experienced is now as if gone. But when in that state, you have access to everything else of life. But in the surface consciousness, you do not have access to that. Now, this kind of experience belongs to us already. That there are states which are conscious of our surface, but the surface is not conscious of them. And if we can train ourselves to access those states more frequently, if we can then train ourselves to remain in those states consciously for longer and longer durations, then it is as if we have awakened into something higher, something deeper, something greater, a awakening of consciousness of a higher degree. And it is something in this direction that continues, which leads us eventually to the consciousness even of the supermind. It is conscious of us even if we are not. And then Sri Aurobindo says, and yet our own incapacity is the only real basis left for the denial of an eternal mind beyond mind, superior to its creations and originative of the cosmos. So the only last argument left is that we are not capable of experiencing it, and therefore we don't know if it exists. But if it exists, and rationally we have seen that there is no other explanation for all the evolutionary process, then that mind exists superior to all that it creates, and it is originative of the cosmos. And this we are convinced. And he says finally, all other foundations for the rejection of this ancient wisdom have disappeared or are disappearing before the increasing light of modern knowledge. So, this is not only a affirmation of what is, but also what is unfolding in human exploration. When Sri Aurobindo wrote this nearly 100 years ago, science had already made enough breakthroughs to come to this conclusion that there is something greater without which all that we observe cannot be explained. It had already come to that point, but its assumption was that that greater thing would be rationally describable and understandable. What it missed was that if you can describe it rationally, there is still one more question left. Why is it that that takes this form of rational description? And that question science cannot answer. And it says it is in the domain beyond science. It goes into domain of metaphysics, philosophy, religion, wherever else it wants to push that responsibility. Because science inherently has limited itself to rationality. And anything beyond rationality, although not irrational, is outside its purview. But in all the pursuit of science subsequently, in the last 100 years, we have only come closer to the recognition that there is something beyond which we are unable to explain after all the efforts we have made. In the domain of artificial intelligence, for example, they describe this as the hard problem. Hard because it's difficult and there is no obvious solution. And it is even in formulating the problem, you know that science cannot answer it rationally. And the hard problem is this. When you look at, let's say, a flower, yes, all the signals have gone into your brain has processed it, recognized it as flower, but there is still in us the experience that I recognize flowerness of the flower. That experience of being aware of the flower, not as a memory of something known or something recognized, but as a thing in itself. The awareness of something in itself. How does that happen? And there's no answer. There's no rational process by which you can come to that experience or that recognition. And so this is the hard problem, and the only solution that the most, let's say, daring scientists have come to, or other scientists in privacy will say, that consciousness comes before matter. Matter is a product of consciousness. So we had this very interesting conversation at Silicon Valley last year, sometime in, I think, April, when a group of representatives of various religious and spiritual traditions met with scientists and researchers in Silicon Valley working in various fields, AI, artificial intelligence, and other kinds of research. And among them was one scientist, I think his name is Federico Fagin, who is the inventor of the first computer chip. And he shared something quite unusual. He had always been brought up in conventional science that consciousness is product of material processes. And then one day, out of the blue, he had an extraordinary experience. I do not remember now the details of the experience, but he narrated it in some dramatic way, that he found himself in a completely different state of consciousness, which was unitive, which was blissful. He experienced oneness with everything. He experienced a kind of a joy and bliss which has no human sensory and emotional equivalent. He stayed in that state long enough that afterwards, when he came back to his normal consciousness, it was obvious to him that the normal consciousness is a highly degenerated and depleted experience of that. And he came to the conclusion that consciousness is first, matter is a product of consciousness, and has been since then trying to develop a whole science around this reversal of priorities. He's been giving lectures all over the place and trying to address it in a way that scientists can be convinced in their own terms of this reversal of the reality. So Sri Aurobindo is placing these two things before us. All the foundations for rejection of this knowledge have disappeared or are disappearing before the increasing light of modern knowledge. And it is inevitable because modern knowledge is trying to find the ultimate reality also. But in this, he uses a phrase, rejection of this ancient wisdom. And ancient wisdom because the knowledge of the supermind's existence, the knowledge of its relationship with our mind, with our life, and all of the universe, has been at the root of the most ancient wisdom traditions, beginning with the Veda, which is the most ancient that we know surviving as a tradition intact without much distortion. And we will find the same idea reflected across the world, across all the cultures, and often couched in symbols which are very similar. You will find, for example, in the Egyptian tradition, there is also this idea, which is represented in various ways. Above the heads of the deities, or sometimes even of the pharaohs, there is a crown, and the crown is often of a weird kind, not at all practical. You will see a big disc, a golden disc, sometimes with it as if two arms reaching out. Or sometimes there is a whole wide wing made of many feathers spread out horizontally, with nobody in particular holding that. Or it is seen as the apex of the pyramid, the top of which is missing in the physical pyramid, but which is described symbolically as a golden apex, or as an eye which is all-seeing, which sees everything in the universe. And each one of these symbols represents a consciousness above mind, which is uniting, all-encompassing. In the pyramid, it has four sides. You will recall Mother's description that the supermind is represented by a square. And then on her own, she says, I don't know why, but that's how it is. But the idea that it is the peak, the apex of the whole ascent of the pyramidal movement of evolution. And if it is not a peak, and the peak is missing because it's not yet expressed, the evolution is not yet complete, it is still seen then as an eye, the eye which sees everything, the eye of knowledge. And from that eye, there are rays which represent the action of that knowledge. So all of these are symbols which you will find across cultures, across traditions, all over the world, if you dig deep enough, go back far enough. And this is the ancient wisdom, which, although in many places lost, is the same wisdom based upon which the fulfillment of our present struggle will be attained. This is the reason why when Sri Aurobindo began to write the Arya 100 years ago, he made it one of his objectives to also turn back to the traditions of the past, draw from them all that was relevant for the present and the future. And this he did by starting the series of chapters, which are now separate books, the chapters on the secret of the Veda, his commentary on the Upanishads, and translations from certain verses of the Veda, and so on. So with this, we have come to a place where this ancient knowledge is before us. The reality of the supermind is now convincingly held to our mind and perceived already intuitively. And the next chapter develops this and shows us how we are to enter in relation with the supermind, what it is, and how it has to emerge in us. What can we do to participate in speeding up our evolution? The chapter is titled Mind and Supermind because he places now these two in relation to each other. Beginning thus, we arrive then at this affirmation of an all cognitive principle superior to mind and exceeding it in nature, scope, and capacity. This is the summary of the previous chapter. There is this principle superior to mind, but it is all cognitive, it holds all knowledge. Human mental rational process is only capturing by indirect processes pieces, glimpses of knowledge. But each time that we have a glimpse of knowledge, notice that in the very dawning of knowledge, the insight that you have, you say, ah, and there is a lighting up. And in the lighting up, there is the sense of familiarity that something in me already knew it. In the recognition, there is an awakening, a revealing of what was already there. So always in the process of mind, in all awakening of knowledge, there is a sense that the knowledge was already there somewhere. But where was it? It was not in the mind or its processes. It was as if behind mind, deeper, higher, above, somewhere. But there is this plane of consciousness in which all knowledge is held. And it is here that we begin to perceive the supermind. So this cognitive, all cognitive principle superior to mind and exceeding it in three things: nature, scope, and capacity. In its nature, that is in the very character of its substance, it is of a higher grade. The Egyptians also used the same symbol here when they referred to gold. They described gold, which is a symbol of the supermind in the domain of metals. They described gold as the substance which forms the body of the gods. Now, if you think about what that means, if you think of it purely in material terms, it doesn't make sense. At best, you will say you have to make statues of gods out of gold. But why? The gold here represents the supramental consciousness. It is out of that substance that the forms of the gods are made. That is, they are formed out of the supramental consciousness. They belong to or are created from there. And in the Veda, we have always this idea that even the gods, as they descend in the evolution or emerge in evolution, they return to their home in the supermind. And as they approach their home, they become more and more brilliant, more and more lustrous, until in their own home, they become beings of light, golden light. In the later tradition, which you find hidden in the mysticism in the West, while under suppression of the church, this knowledge became buried in symbols of what is called alchemy. And it is the same idea in alchemy that a base metal is transmuted into gold. That is the human substance or the human consciousness, which is base meaning fallen, low, inferior, is transmuted to become divine and represented by the gold. Now, that whole transmutation process was a spiritual transmutation process. It had psychological components also, and it could be reflected in material processes and in actual manufacture of gold or transmuting of metal. But that was incidental, that was secondary. The whole language was what in the Tantra is called the twilight language. It has a double meaning. You can hear the same thing and understand it in purely spiritual and psychological terms, or you can understand it in material terms. And then if you apply it materially, somehow it doesn't seem to have much result. So, all of these I point to because they help us to see that it is not a new idea. It has always been there, although lost, although distorted, forgotten, recovered, and in many ways mixed up. It has always been there. And this idea of the nature of the supermind being essentially superior was represented in these images and symbols. The scope of the mind, the supermind, also is much larger. While our mind can catch a piece at a time and then sequentially arrange pieces, and by the time it moves to the second or third piece, it has lost the first piece, and so needs to summarize the whole thing and symbolically represent by another level of a piece of abstraction, until eventually it holds abstractions of abstractions of abstractions, never holds the thing itself. In contrast to this, the supermind, in one single sweeping, all encompassing consciousness, holds it all. It does not need to go by piece after piece. It has it all simultaneously. And the closest image we can have is when you see the full picture in a single gaze, and the mind sees one piece at a time, like a big puzzle which has been cut up and broken up and then mixed up. The mind looks at a piece at a time and thinks how to join this piece with the other piece. It never sees the picture, it sees fragments of the picture. Whereas the supermind sees the full picture in a single shot. That would be an equivalent description. So the scope of the supermind is also always complete and infinite. And finally, the capacity of the supermind is in the very nature of its action. It acts on the whole because it is a consciousness of the whole. The rational mind, because it only grasps at pieces, even when it acts, its action is on one piece at a time. So when you have the puzzle before you, you take a piece and then you turn it around, try to fit it with another piece. It doesn't fit. You try another piece, fit it, flip it, it doesn't. You try another until something clicks. You say, my logic has given me a solution. But that's all that the logic did. It attempted to fit pieces until something fitted. But notice, even in this simple logical action, what recognized that the piece fits and the picture is continuous? That was not logical. That was the supermind acting through mind. It saw the connection, the continuity, the oneness behind. But because it acts through mind, it is acting in a partial, reduced function. But it is that which makes the mind recognize the truth of even its logic. And it keeps on joining pieces like that. And suddenly it realizes that one of the pieces which fitted was wrong. It's not fitting quite right because of something else, and it has to start all over again in rearranging. And that's how science works. But the supermind sees in one go all the pieces in all their right relation without a process to be done. It sees, it acts, puts it all together instantly. So it is this exceeding in nature, scope, and capacity. All of this Sri Aurobindo will elaborate in his commentary as we proceed. For the Upanishad affirms a mind beyond mind as a result of intuition and spiritual experience. And its existence is equally a necessary conclusion from the facts of the cosmic evolution. So he is summarizing all that we have discussed in the previous chapter. From the facts of cosmic evolution, we recognize, yes, there is a supermind. Upanishad recognizes it by intuition and spiritual experience, and these two have in our consciousness now joined. And now the next question, which is the theme of the chapter. What then is this mind beyond mind? How does it function? Or by what means shall we arrive at the knowledge of it or possess it? So there will be a description of what this consciousness is, mind beyond mind. There will be a description of how it acts, how it functions, and then the means by which we can know it and the means by which we can ascend and possess it. That will be the theme of this chapter. And this is so practical, as you can see. There would be no point if we simply stop by saying, oh, yes, there is such a thing, and we will get to it eventually, unless one can develop an actual practice for attaining to it. And this, in fact, is the intention of the Kena Upanishad. So Sri Aurobindo continues, the Upanishad asserts about this supreme cognitive principle, first, that it is beyond the reach of mind and the senses. Secondly, that it does not itself think with the mind. Thirdly, that it is that by which mind itself is thought or mentalized. Fourthly, that it is the very nature or description of the Brahman consciousness. So all this is part of the Kena Upanishad in the verses we have already seen. And just to review those verses, the second verse says, that which is hearing of our hearing, mind of our mind, speech of our speech, that too is life of our life breath and sight of our sight. The wise are released beyond, and they pass from this world and become immortal. And the next verse, their sight travels not, nor speech, nor mind. We know it not, nor can distinguish how one should teach of it, for it is other than the known. So the mind can not only reach it, it cannot even articulate it, because it belongs to a domain which is outside the known domain of the mind. So he says, and then the verse continues, it is there above the unknown. It is so we have heard from men of old who declared that to our understanding. And then finally, verse 5, that which thinks not by the mind, that by which the mind is thought, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. And this very first sentence, yan manasa na manute, which is translated as that which thinks not by the mind, can also be translated as that which one thinks not with the mind. So it has a double meaning at the same time. You cannot think of it with the mind because it is not in the domain of mental ideas. Equally, that does not think with mind. It has a different way of cognizing, of thinking, if at all we can call thinking. So across these verses, you will find these four ideas have been placed. First, that it is beyond the reach of the mind and the senses. Second, that it does not itself think with the mind. Third, that it is that by which mind itself is thought or mentalized. And fourth, that it is the very nature or description of the Brahman consciousness. So now he continues, when we say, however, that a mind of mind is the nature or description of the Brahman consciousness, we must not forget that the absolute Brahman in itself is held to be unknowable and therefore beyond description. It is unknowable not because it is a void and capable of no description except that of nothingness, nor because, although positive in experience, it has no content or quality, but because it is beyond all things that our present instruments of knowledge can conceive. And because the methods of ideation and expression proper to our mentality do not apply to it. That's why we cannot reach it. It is the absolute of all things that we know, and of each thing that we know, and yet nothing, nor any sum of things can exhaust or characterize its essential being. For its manner of being is other than that which we call existence. Its unity resists all analysis. Its multiple infinities exceed every synthesis. Therefore, it is not in its absolute essentiality that it can be described as mind of our mind, but in its fundamental nature in regard to our mental existence. Brahman consciousness is the eternal outlook of the absolute upon the relative. Now, this whole thing I've read in one go because it is the scope of what we will take up also in more detail next time. But for now, just we get a broad sense of what he is getting us to recognize. When we have spoken of Brahman, by definition, Brahman represents something which is beyond description, beyond knowing. And so, how can we say this mind of our mind is Brahman? And he's really answering this question. In answering this, he has brought up many different facets to the problem and brought them together in a single sentence. So we look at the different facets. First, that when we say Brahman is unknowable, often we conceive of an unknowable as a void. If your mind was asked, can you imagine what it would be like that something is unknowable? Your mind immediately conceives of something which is formless, which is like a blank, which is like an emptiness. Because anything that you can conceive of, you are giving to it a form. If it has a form, then you can conceive of it. But if you say it is unknowable, then it has to kind of go into an abstraction beyond form. So automatically we conceive of it as a blankness, emptiness. So he says it is not unknowable because it is a void. So that's an error of our mind because we are not able to get to what it actually is. Second, he says, it is not unknowable because it is not capable of description except the description of nothingness. It is actually capable of description. But the description would not exhaust it. So one simple description you can have of that is infinite potential. All possibilities, all qualities, all experiences, all things, all forms, anything that you could ever imagine or conceive or beyond your imagination, all that put together simultaneously in a single identity of awareness is that. Now, having said all this, we've still not completed what that is. Not only because it is infinite potential, even though we take infinity, it exceeds even all this. It exceeds all qualities and can stand back beyond all qualities and can be without all qualities while still having all qualities. So at that point, the mind has no way of conceiving. All qualities we can still conceive of as put it all together. It goes beyond all qualities, all right, it breaks away from all this together. But it is both, doesn't make sense. I cannot conceive of it. But if you try to conceive of it, you'll find your mind becomes kind of numb. It goes into a stupor. It cannot picturize, but it senses. And if you allow that sensing experience to unfold, that's when the intuition kicks in. And an intuitive feel, you can say, yeah, I get a feel of it, but I can't reduce it to picture. I can't reduce it to thought. I can't reduce it to word, but I get a sense of what that is like. And that's closer to what it is. But there would still be something beyond. So, it is unknowable not because it is a void and capable of no description except that of nothingness, nor because, although positive in experience, it has no content or quality. So, it's not unknowable. There are many negatives here, but it's not unknowable because, although it is positive, it has no content. We could say, when we say it is all things and yet it is beyond them, automatically our mind says, takes out all the content. No, it's not even that, although it has all positives. But because it is unknowable, because it is beyond all things that our present instruments of knowledge can conceive. First reason. Our current instruments of knowledge are still very weak. We can even say they are incomplete. There are greater powers of knowledge than what has so far been evolved in our mind and through our senses. In fact, if you see what science does in its pursuit of understanding the universe, because our instruments are inferior, it develops instruments which are able to go deeper. So our sensory instruments cannot see beyond the narrow band of visible light. So we have developed instruments which will image for us infrared, ultraviolet, radio waves, ultrasonics, all kinds of ranges of vibrations which our senses cannot perceive. These instruments will reduce or translate to what our senses can perceive. And through that, we validate that yes, there is a whole range of reality to which we are blind, deaf, and incapable of sensation. In a similar way, we have developed technologies which, in the domain of artificial intelligence, we call deep learning. Our intellect, because it handles pieces, and the pieces itself, it can only hold a few at a time, it cannot handle large amounts of data. It cannot pursue analysis which goes layers within layers within layers within layers of extreme. They say when you play chess, the greatest grandmasters can only anticipate 6 steps ahead. But already with 6 steps ahead, there are so many possibilities. 1 step ahead, there are, let's say, 3 meaningful possibilities, for each of which there are another 3 meaningful, for each of which there's another 3 meaningful, and so on. 6 steps already becomes a huge number. For the mind even to weigh which of these is superior is not possible. And so we have developed machines which do that for us. What do? They actually follow the process which our mind would have gone through. They do it more rapidly on larger data. But if we had 1,000 people working away for 1,000 years, we would do that also. But the computer does the same thing in a few seconds or less. So innately, the methods used by these instruments are not different from our methods of rationality. And yet, through that, we are able to do so much more. So a deep learning algorithm, a deep learning artificial intelligence can come to certain conclusions which human beings have taken sometimes centuries. You can give it a few rules of the game, tell it what is it the outcome that you want, and sometimes within minutes or a few hours, it will tell you what is the best strategy for winning the game. And it will develop that strategy on its own by experimenting all possibilities and drawing conclusions, and then play against you and defeat you. So almost all the popular games which are out there have been fed to these machines, and the machines have learned them often within a few hours or days. And now when you put that kind of intelligence on the humongous amount of data which is there in social media, on the internet, spread out all over, they can draw conclusions which are astonishing. Almost they seem to be almost miraculous, prophetic, or intuitive even. But they're not. They're still processes which are moving very fast. And so the present instruments of knowledge, although we recognize their limitation, we have found means to amplify them. Still, these means are of the inferior mode of the knowledge itself. The access to the experience of Brahman consciousness requires a very different kind of instrument of knowledge. And that those instruments exist within us in potential. They even exist in a rudimentary form, and by a persistent effort to develop them, we can awaken them sufficiently that we are able to experience the Brahman consciousness. As things are, because those instruments are not well developed, if we were spontaneously pushed into an experience of Brahman consciousness in that rudimentary form of that instrument, we would often enter a state of swoon. That is, we would lose all awareness of the physical senses, all our rational processes would shut down, mind would become silent, life energies would become quiet, and we would be in some kind of a deep state of trance. When we emerge out of that, we would have the vivid sense of having been in something extraordinary, something beautiful, something which is a undifferentiated, perhaps oneness of consciousness or a transcendence beyond space or time. We would have a memory of it, but not the living experience of it in the very act of emerging. Because we are returning to the instruments of cognition which are incapable of holding that. Just as a quick example, can you conceive of infinity? And the moment you turn your mind to try to conceive of infinity, you see this huge space extending and extending and extending and extending beyond galaxies and keeping on extending. The moment you stop, you've stopped at a finite limit. You've never touched infinity. The only way our mind is able to conceive infinity is an ongoing widening of finites. We can never grasp the infinite there in one go. Whereas a level just above, in the intuitive consciousness already, we are able to experience that in a single shot, a consciousness which is infinite. I am, or I know the infinite. There is no expansion which is continuously occurring. It is not a finite growing. It is, and that's it. So the power of the mind is so limited. It cannot even conceive of infinity. It cannot conceive of eternity. How would you conceive of eternity? And again, you'll go backward in time and forward in time and keep growing and growing and growing. But you do not know it all in a single. Cannot. But the consciousness which knows Brahman has to have that capacity because Brahman is inherently infinite and eternal. And so there is a layer above where these powers are there in us, not yet fully developed. But in the partial way that they exist, we can experience that, but we lose it on recovery, on return to our normal consciousness. And so there's a kind of a gap. But if we develop these powers of cognition, and we ascend in our consciousness, where now the capacity to know infinity and eternity is there, maybe still degrees of infinities and eternities, still. There we can begin to sense the Brahman and retain awareness of Brahman without losing it in our waking state. And then we could live in Brahman consciousness and still look upon the world and interact with the world, and Brahman would be in world, not separate from it, although transcending it. But at that point, if you were asked, can you describe what you're experiencing? Then you'll struggle to give word to it. You'll say, it is infinite. What does that mean, infinite? And again, you have a problem, because if you have not experienced infinity, how do you convey to someone who has not experienced color what color is like? So to the mind which does not know infinity but has only an idea of infinity, which as an idea is only a symbol, not an experience, how do you say what is infinite? What does it feel like? Or how do you see to that consciousness the whole universe is experienced as one continuity, while the mind sees pieces of objects? It sees only continuities. And so in that consciousness, you look at a flower, you know the flower from the moment it emerged as a bud, grew and developed to this bloom, and from the bloom, all the possibilities of its further eventual breakdown and mixing into matter, and the full journey of the flower's life is all seen in a single awareness. Not only seen, experienced, and known in the consciousness as if you are one with it. Not only that, the relationship of the flower with the trees and the bees and the birds and the human beings and all the possible uses that it could have been put through in its lifetime are all seen simultaneously. Not only these, but each of those trees and bees and birds and human beings in their relationships with everything else in the universe. And you experience the whole universe in all its complexities of interrelationships at the same time as you know the flower. The flower is not separate from universe. It is universe putting forward a single front of flower. And I meet the whole universe when I meet the flower. Now this is possible only to a consciousness which is as wide as the universe, which includes the universe in itself. And so it meets the whole universe when it meets flower. But our mind being made of peace functions, catching objects in separation from each other, sees flower and then sees universe behind, and flower as part of or product of process in the universe. And even then, it does not experience what the flower experiences. It only reflects the form and color of the flower. And it only takes you a few seconds to realize, oh, this is plastic flower and not real flower. So the two are completely different in their functioning, and the tools required to experience that are not yet sufficiently developed in us. So he says, because it is beyond all things that our present instruments of knowledge can conceive. And second, because the methods of ideation and expression proper to our mentality do not apply to it. What is the method of ideation and expression? I have to form an idea. I have to form a thought. I have to associate with a word and then give it form. So when you ask me, what is bliss? It's not pleasure, it's not pain, it's not feel good, it's not happiness. What is it? How does one explain? I was told this incident. There was a very an extraordinary sadhak in the ashram by the name of Medhananda. Even the name was significant. It was the name given to him by the mother, I think. Medhananda, Medha and Ananda. Medha is that intense higher power of the mind, and the bliss of Medha. So he was sitting once with a group of, I think it was a German group. And in a casual discussion, some lady asked him casually, Medhananda, what is Ananda? And the person described to me, he just looked at her and beamed a smile. And you could feel something flowing from him to her. It hit her with an intensity, and she just began to weep and weep and weep. A brief touch of Ananda, and she could not contain it. But the experience could be given. And in the experience is the evidence of what it is. If you try to convey through words, it will make no sense. It is like trying to explain to a monkey what it is like to enjoy reading a beautiful novel or a beautiful poetry. What do you feel when you read beautiful poetry? The monkey will say, is it what I feel when I jump from one tree to another? No, it's not. But what do you feel? There's nothing in his experience to match that. So Ananda can be experienced only by consciousness which is above the dualities, which is innately infinite, which is innately unitive. And so the means that we have, the methods of ideation and the methods of expression which belong to our mentality do not apply to it, and therefore we cannot know it. And this is a very different approach from not knowing it as compared to many traditions existing which say we cannot know it because it is emptiness, because it is transcendent, because it is beyond everything. And so they picturize it as something which is outside the universe and separate from the universe. Whereas the way Sri Aurobindo is articulating is, it is there, it even includes the universe, but we cannot know it because the instruments for knowing it in its own terms are not yet developed in us. Now we may go so far as to say, actually, we do know Brahman, but not as Brahman. We know it as universe. Through our present senses, through our mind, whom are we seeing? Whom are we touching? Whom are we smelling, breathing, eating, interacting with? It is Brahman. But our instruments being, we are meeting Brahman as made up of so many pieces and so many processes. We do not know Brahman as Brahman. And so we do not call that Brahman. We are like an ant wandering on the foot of an elephant and trying to figure out what is this creature. It sees only and experiences only a tiny piece and fragment of it and is incapable of conceiving of the whole. And so for that, these higher instruments of knowledge have to awaken, and the methods of that knowledge also of a superior grade have to develop. And he says, in sum, it is the absolute of all things that we know, and of each thing that we know, and yet nothing nor any sum of things can exhaust or characterize its essential being. We'll see this in more detail next time, but just to complete this discussion, it is not separate from these things which we know. If we took all the things that we know and pushed them into their absolute possibility, absolute potential, absolute truth and existence, we would get to that. But we are unable to know these things in their absolute. We can only have the idea of an absolute, but not know the absolute. But in this, we recognize that that is not separate from this. It is the fulfillment of all these, the origination of all these, and the perfection of all these. But it is not separate. So Brahman, now we begin already to see differently, to conceive, feel, and relate to differently. And he concludes this paragraph. We'll see the other points also where he develops this relation with the Brahman. He says, Brahman consciousness is the eternal outlook of the absolute upon the relative. And it is therefore the bridging of the absolute and the relative. And how then, although it is beyond our speech, beyond our senses, beyond our mind, how then can we know it? How then can we enter in relation with it, arrive at its knowledge, and eventually realize it and possess it? That will be the theme for the rest of the chapter. We can meditate on this for a few minutes.